So here's sort of an eye response curve. So if we want to try to visualize what is our eye actually seeing. So again, here we have in the lower left, 400 nanometers, we don't see into the UV. At 700 on over, we don't see IR. This is your eye's perception, and this has been agreed to since 1931. There may be some differences of opinion as we develop technologies more, but for the sake of argument, we say that's what our eye can see. This is what a film curve looked like. So this is daylight, and we see a number of things immediately. So at 400, we see that there's sensitivity to the UV. We needed a sky filter, a UV filter. There was sensitivity to UV in the sky that would overexpose. You needed to throw that filter on the lens to make sure that you weren't blowing out your sky. You see the offset in the red. Not that this is bad, it's just different. And this is where the whole concept of there were certain colors that film never read accurately. It's part of the explanation, is its response curves. So it was always important. When things were simple, we had time to do the camera tests. You tested your film stock, you made sure the film stock came from the, you picked your film stock, you went for a single batch code, as much as you could, order 300,000 feet of film, hope that you can stay within that budget. And then you stuck with a lab, you tested your lenses. There was nothing much more that could knock off your color calculations than that. So now this is a typical response curve from one of the better known cameras. I'm not going to identify any of them because, again, this is not about saying that something is better or worse. It's about showing the differences. So here's a camera that actually very closely follows the eye response. And you get very good results with it. And it's very popular. Here's another very popular camera. Different. Still renders really interesting images, great images. A little bit of sensitivity in the UV. Knowing this, you may want to consider using a UV filter when you're shooting. Here's another one. Brilliant images, it's just different. So once you start combining this together with the discontinuous spectrum of an LED, you can expect to see some differences in response. And this is where the frustration comes in, where you think you've got it all figured out. You go to a different camera. It's always worked for you in the past, working with a certain light, and now suddenly, whew, it didn't quite look that way last time around. So this is basically some of the things that would explain it. I think we also need to understand gamut. It gets bantered a lot. What exactly is it? So gamut refers to the entire range of colors available on a particular device, such as a cinema camera, a lighting fixture, a projector, or a monitor. Now, these will all have their own gamut, and they don't necessarily all have to align with each other. So that green line represents Rec 709. So that is your basic workflow that we've had for the last, God knows, 10, 12 years. There are a number of other common gamuts that we hear about. So P3, it's a color space for digital projection. You can see it's larger than 709. 2020, even bigger, again for Ultra HD. There's one that we found here that's Canon uses something called a cinema gamut, and it encapsulates pretty much all the of the CIE space that is reproducible, or you can hope to maybe generate some light or something in that range. And then you have ACES, which encapsulates the entire range, and I'll talk more about that. So that's sort of an idea of, in our industry right now, these are all very active gamuts that will, when you're in post, you'll have the option of working with these. Now, in the fact that we gathered all this data on the cameras, if you go online, you say, camera gamut for a particular camera, you'll find out, for the most part, that it'll say there's no such thing, because gamuts are, or spectral response data is not something that is shared by the camera companies. But the fact that we modeled it gave us the data that we can actually generate the gamut. In no particular order of those three cameras, this is sort of what they look like. They're different. And so when it comes to certain subtleties, one camera may see things that another camera cannot see. Most importantly, though, for everything that I'd say 99%, 98% of what we shoot is about rendering reflected colors, the environment around us, skin tones, faces, all that thing. That all falls into the middle, into the white zone anyway. So you're going to have that in 709, you're going to have it in every gamut. And the gamut is not going to make a difference in that zone. It only comes into play if you're trying to hit certain saturated colors, and if that's really important, then you need to do testing just like in the old days. Just as film didn't see everything, electronic cinema camera won't see it all. But again, it's interesting to see how some see way down into the deep reds, others not as much. Again, it doesn't make them any better or worse, just it's different. Since we have all the data on film stock, and we never thought of film as having a gamut, I thought it would just be interesting to see what a film gamut would have looked like. So there's 2020 and Rec 709. There's tungsten. So it's outside of 709. And it actually kind of follows very closely to P3. I didn't put P3 in there because it would kind of clutter it up. And daylight, again, very similar. So, which is one of the reasons that in today's world we can actually go film negative and still see some saturated colors now, pull out saturated colors that we might not have seen before. ACES, important to understand what ACES is. It's the Academy Color Encoding System. It's defined by the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. And again, this has grown out of a real anxiety of how do we manage digital data as the next generation of imaging comes along and history starts piling up the years, and we're reaching back 50 years to try to reproduce a film that we have digital data on, but now the display devices, everything in the technology has moved on. How do we access that digital data and try to reconform it to work in the new environment? So the thought was, if we make this damn thing big enough, it's going to capture everything we can possibly throw at it, which makes sense. So this is considered your digital source master. And so you basically, when you're shooting your movie, you're bringing it in through ACES. You're using a color transform language supplied by the manufacturer that says this raw data coming in is going to be processed in X fashion. And you do your post-flow. And now you have basically a map that's laid out within this space. So the next technology comes along, and maybe you've had to time it out for 709 or P3, and the next thing comes along, and it's a really broad gamut. Well, using the CTL, color transform language, you can redefine those color points to the newer technologies. So this is the hope that that acts as a digital negative. So as new color transform codes are written, it'll just simply convert this older data into a new format. So we have a gamut. It's compared to 709, P3, 2020. So color gamut for manufacturers are going to vary because we're all going to be working with slightly different primary color points. So it usually starts with red, green, blue. That defines the outside perimeter. Depending on what you've done to generate your whites, that'll all fall within there. It doesn't necessarily affect your overall gamut. Now, if you're going to be going for theatrical colors maybe, and you want to expand your gamut, then you're going to have to introduce a few other colors. So amber is one, cyan, lime green, rose red. And what it does is it helps you open up that gamut. So if you're trying to go for the broadest range of theatrical gels, you want to add numerous color points to try to open up that gamut. This type of color generation, it's called additive color mixing, and it's really limited to what can be created by mixing these RGB values. If you're trying to develop a color that's outside of those points, it's just not going to happen. Now, what's common to everything here is the white. The white falls in the middle. It's full spectrum assures your best skin tones and tonal reproductions. It'll also illuminate colors that may fall outside of the camera or the display gamut. So there are reflected values on your subject matter. That white, if it's a full spectrum, will illuminate that, and it'll reflect back to the camera. So, as said before, if you want to generate a saturated color, the greater number of color points are going to give you that. But keep in mind that if the color falls outside of the camera gamut, it'll still be rendered, but at a lower saturation level. So sometimes these subtleties are not that noticeable, and in some cases they may be noticeable depending on what exactly you're trying to do. Again, it goes back to you want to test all this in advance. There's an interesting situation that if you are trying to produce a color that you're not capable of producing because you don't have the color points to blend in, you can still do that, and by using a gel. So it's basically a subtractive color mixing. So what it is, if you've got, say, a yellow that you want to generate, put that yellow gel in front of a white source, and if you've got a good full spectrum white to begin with, it's going to cancel out all the other wavelengths and just let through that yellow band. So, for example, yellow gel on a white source can get you out to that saturation. So the camera is going to read out that, outside of that. So it means don't necessarily throw away your gels when you're in a bit of a bind. The gels are still going to deliver potentially great qualities. So they still serve a purpose. Here was a test that was done at AFI. At AFI, the cinematography students are required to hand in a sort of a color palette of what they expect to be their production to look like. So they choose a range of colors that they're trying to reproduce. So in this particular case, they were trying to do a Storaro yellow, which, by the way, is very close to a Lee 101. So he said the way of doing, so the test was done this way. They measured a tungsten source, came in at 2900, set the camera to 2900. You got a neutral white Kelvin. That's what you would expect. Put a gel on it, looks fine. That's what it looks like on tungsten. Do the same thing with an LED. Dial in 29 on the LED, 29 on the camera. White looks like that. Put a gel on it, very close match. And here's the fun part. We now try to dial in that color just using the RGBs of the fixture at 2900 Kelvin set on the camera, and that's what came out. And immediately it was like, oh my God, I know we've done something wrong. What is wrong? I think it's well, we're using a dimmer board. It's most probably got the wrong profile in there. And bottom line was, no, everything was done correct. This test I shot on an HDSLR. Their test was shot on an Alexa. So we know that this phenomenon can happen to a high-grade camera and to one that's also mid-grade. But what it turned out to be is the camera response curves at 2900 with that gel, with that combination of trying to dial in gel, it wasn't within the response capability of that camera to resolve that color. So I thought, okay, if it can't do it at 2900, since the chip is a daylight bias anyway, what if I take it to its native daylight? At 6500, it came in desaturated just as I would expect. So what it shows me is that the spectral response of that chip at 6500, which is its native Kelvin, pretty much got what I expected. But when you take that, and again, this is all mathematics and algorithms, you turn that sensitivity to 2900, it may fall apart. And I say may because I didn't test all the cameras that are out there. This is just an illustration between a high-grade and a lower-grade camera, and very much the same results. And this is the kind of thing you want to avoid on the first or second or at any time in production. And this is where they did it in pre-production and then had to figure out a way around it. Their solution was to simply throw the gel on the LED. And they were able to stay within their original plan. So these are some of the ways that just when you think you've got it all pat, it's all down. And your eye, by the way, would see that color up there as yellow. You wouldn't even dispute it for a second. So there was another interesting thing that I came across, and it's called Pointer's gamut. Now, these are the real-world colors that a display device will reproduce just with reflected white light. And to me, it was interesting. It doesn't follow any kind of necessarily a triangle. And it's sort of, it falls outside of 709. But it's well within 2020. So again, these are all different ways of considering a light. So you can think of a light as a white light source that I'm going to use on subject, and it's going to reflect back its color to the camera. What is the camera going to see? That's sort of what it'll see in that mode. The other one is, am I trying to use this as a gel color, and I'm trying to project the color onto the subject? That's going to be defined differently depending on which fixtures you use.